She said you didn't flinch, not when she wept, not when she confessed, not even when she begged you to become the man she imagined. Your eyes didn't tremble, your voice didn't chase. You watched her break as if it were a performance in a theater that no longer sells tickets. And that silence, the one you offered like a gift, she couldn't unwrap, it stayed, unapologetic, unmoving. And for that, she feared you, because guilt is the leash. It keeps the beast inside the cage, the hero kneeling at the altar, the man apologizing for his hunger. But you buried guilt long ago, didn't you? Somewhere between your last illusion and your first act of defiance. You killed the lamb in you, and now the wolves gather in your smile. What woman could trust a man who does not kneel before her sadness? But what woman could resist him either? If this whisper already tastes like you, if her fear has ever turned into your crown, then let it echo. Like the video, leave your trace in the dark. Subscribe and stay where guilt cannot follow. A man without guilt becomes a surface where others see only themselves, and they panic when he does not distort. You stopped reflecting them the moment you stopped seeking forgiveness. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cruel. You simply began standing still when the wind expected you to sway, and they called it coldness. They called it narcissism. But what really terrified them was this: you were no longer a mirror, because a mirror, you see, is supposed to bend, to warp, to blur itself, to flatter the shape before it. Women have always known this game, the game of speaking not to a man, but to his reflection of them. And as long as he mirrors their shame, mirrors their longing, mirrors their moral illusions, they feel safe. Because then he is still playing the part of the trained, remorseful man, the one taught to apologize for his instincts, to smile at his own castration, to feel guilt simply for wanting without permission. But you unlearned that. When she tested you, you didn't pass. You didn't fail. You simply didn't care to take the test. You heard the bait in her voice, the kind that dangles beneath a compliment, the kind that wants you to confess your violence, your need, your animal, and instead, you said nothing. You let the silence say more than virtue ever could. That's when she began to feel it, the unraveling, not in you, in herself. Because the mirror no longer gave back the fantasy. She could not see her goodness in your regret. She could not see her innocence in your excuses. And so she accused you of being dangerous, not because you harmed her, but because you refused to kneel and offer yourself as proof that she was right all along. You robbed her of the thing the modern world promises every wounded ego, that somewhere there's a man who will wear the blame like a badge just to prove how good she is. But you didn't. You wouldn't. You made her face herself. It is unbearable to some, the man who stands there, seeing everything, and still unmoved. He becomes the cold glass that does not lie, the sacred mirror that does not flatter, that does not weep, that does not bend. And so she calls you names, not because they're true, but because they're spells, control tactics, desperate rituals to force the old you back, the one who flinched, who fawned, who mirrored back her pain with guilt softening your voice. You don't do that now. You learned that guilt is not goodness. That guilt is not proof of soul. That guilt, in fact, is often just the last chain you carry from a mother's manipulation, a teacher's slap, a lover's shame puppetry. You saw it for what it was, not a compass, but a leash. And when you cut it, they gasped. Because here's the secret: when a man no longer mirrors, he becomes a myth. He becomes unknowable. And what women cannot predict, they fear and desire. She will say you don't feel, that you're distant, that you lack empathy. But what she means is this: you don't collapse under my sorrow. You don't melt when I test you. You don't perform regret when I need to feel superior. And in that space where you used to mirror her pain, you now become something far more dangerous. You become her reflection stripped of illusion. You become the thing that shows her what she really is. And what is she? A creature of contradictions. A mask of grace with rage underneath. A temple of virtue built atop rituals of seduction. And when she sees that truly sees it without your guilt to blur it, she doesn't know whether to kiss you or kill you. Because to her, guilt was the contract. If she hurts, you must apologize. If she doubts, you must explain. If she accuses, you must confess. This is the courtship script, and you've burned it. You no longer flinch at her disappointment. You no longer distort to soothe her. You offer no performance, no penitence. And this is the horror she cannot find herself in you anymore. Only the truth, and the truth is loveless. It has no makeup. It has no filter. It does not curve its edges to save anyone's feelings. You don't reflect the woman she wishes to be. You reveal the woman she actually is. And this is what they mean when they say, he has no guilt. It is not that you are evil. It is not that you are cruel. It is that you do not hallucinate remorse when they expect you to. You do not fake weakness for their emotional security. You do not make yourself smaller just to protect the story they tell themselves about being the morally superior sex. Because you have remembered something ancient. Before guilt became fashion. Before men were taught to apologize for being fire and stone. Before desire was pathologized. Before self-possession was called arrogance. You remembered the sacred stillness of the untamed man. The one who does not mirror because he has become the mirror's destroyer. And so they panic. Not because you are wrong, but because you are not controllable. Because their tears no longer hypnotize you. Because their silence is no longer louder than yours. Because you have stopped performing the dance of the guilty son. Now you are the god without a shrine, and in your eyes they see something that has not existed in a long, long time. Not cruelty, not indifference, but a terrifying clarity. And they realize this without your guilt. They are naked, not in flesh, but in fantasy, not in skin, but in illusion. Their entire ritual of emotional superiority gone. Their mask of moral victimhood melting, because without a man's guilt to kneel before it, the performance cannot go on. You have become the death of their script. You are the scene they cannot direct, and now the only thing left for them to see is themselves. So they call you monster, but monsters only exist in stories, and you, now, are outside of stories, outside of scripts, outside of shame. You are no longer the mirror. You are the flame that cracked it. Desire without shame terrifies the soul that survives on obedience. It is the return of the pagan flame. You didn't ask permission to want her. That was the first rupture, the first heresy. You let your gaze linger, not as a question, but as a declaration. You didn't soften it with compliments. You didn't shrink it beneath poetic disguise. You stared, and not out of rudeness, but out of ancient remembrance. As if your eyes still remembered what it meant to take in the world as a beast who chose, and she felt it. Not the look, but the absence of apology behind it. The clean, silent, unapologetic fact of your wanting, and that not your words, not your touch is what shook her, because she has been told her entire life that men must justify their hunger. They must earn it with poems, prove it with guilt, wash it clean in rituals of suffering. She has been raised in a culture where male desire is guilty until proven pure, where to want is a crime unless sanctioned by the right scripts romantic scripts, spiritual scripts, scripts of wounded longing. But you wanted like a man who had not read those scripts, like a man who had burned them. You didn't need her to understand you. You didn't need her to say yes. You simply were, and so she feared you. Not because you threatened her, not because you touched her, but because your presence reminded her that desire, real desire, lives outside morality. It is not about good or evil. It is not about virtue. It is about flame. And you carried that flame without a leash. Most men, she has known, treat their hunger like a dog on a chain. They show it only when it's been trained. They feed it on command. They apologize when it growls. And she learned to feel safe among such men who ask her what to feel, how to feel, when to feel. Men who wrap their need in shame. Men who crawl toward her and call it love. But then came you, and your hunger did not crawl. It stood, not aggressive, not cruel, just sovereign. You didn't explain your attraction. You didn't narrate it. You didn't hide behind irony or apology. You let it exist unwashed, unfiltered, undomesticated. And in doing so, you exposed how many men before you had lied, not just to her but to themselves. Because the modern man's seduction is a theater of guilt. Every compliment is veiled repentance. Every move rehearsed to appear accidental. He flatters, he dances, he self-deprecates all to cloak the unbearable truth he wants. And he is ashamed of wanting. But you broke the fourth wall. You didn't perform the performance. You didn't beg to be seen as good. You were not asking to be absolved. You were not seeking redemption. You wanted. That was all. And it was enough. And this is what makes women afraid of men who feel no guilt. Not fear in the sense of physical threat. Fear in the deeper sense, the mythic sense, the fear of the forbidden masculine. The primal, the one who does not kneel to the gods of sensitivity and guilt. The one whose eyes hold fire and do not blink. Because this man cannot be shaped by shame. This man does not perform desire as an apology for his existence. This man reminds her of something dangerous and sacred. He reminds her that before shame, there was instinct, before etiquette, there was gravity, before guilt. There was the sun, and it did not ask the earth for permission to shine. And you, now, are the sun. You do not orbit, you do not plead, you burn. And that burning it awakens something in her, something that centuries of civilization have tried to kill, a memory in her blood, a trembling, aching memory of when men were not safe, but sovereign, when they did not whisper love through locked jaws and soft hands, when they were not harmless. She has been told all her life to seek safety, to want the man who apologizes for taking up space. But something deeper in her, the part she won't name, watches you and does not turn away. Because the man who does not apologize for his hunger becomes the flame around which the lies melt. And in that melting, she sees her own hunger reflected. She sees the ways she has also lied, pretended to not want what she wants, called men weak so she wouldn't have to admit she needed their strength, called herself liberated while secretly aching to be seen not as an idea, not as a princess, not as a goddess, but as a woman. And you look at her like that. Not as an angel, not as a victim, not as a prize, but as a body, as a presence, as a pulse in time. And that look, that raw, unfiltered look, does what 1,000 compliments cannot. It undoes her, because it comes not from a man trying to earn her, but from a man who has already chosen her, not as a conquest, not as a trophy, but as a witness to his own refusal to shrink. You make no promises, you tell no lies, you want. And the wanting is holy because it does not kneel. She may flee from you. She may test you. She may accuse you of being too much, too intense, too direct. But she will never forget you. Because in a world of men who bow before desire like it is sin, you reminded her that desire when clean of guilt is divinity. You reminded her that hunger, when unashamed, becomes truth. And in that truth, she is no longer the one with all the power, and that is why she fears you. Because you do not beg for her approval, because your desire is not contingent on her permission, because you are not a child playing dress-up in a man's skin, asking to be liked. You are the storm that does not knock. You are the man who walked into her world, burning, and said nothing. And in the silence that followed, she saw herself naked, real, wanting and unable to hide behind the old games. You became the end of her control and the beginning of her memory, the memory of fire, the memory of man, the memory of hunger that does not apologize. To not explain, to not beg is to become the eye of the world's hysteria, and women call that cruelty. You said nothing, not because you didn't care, not because you didn't feel, but because the moment demanded stillness and you obeyed the deeper law. While she flailed for answers, twisted her voice into blades, hurled storms of meaning at you, you simply watched. Not as a judge, not as a savior, as a witness. And that is what terrified her. She expected your silence to break under pressure, that you would defend yourself, that you would reassure her, soothe her, explain what you meant and why you meant it and how much you still adored her, that you would dance around her fury like a man who fears being unloved. But you didn't. You let the lightning strike. You let her scream, and you watched her, not with malice, not with pity, but with a depth she could not decode. The kind of gaze that says, I am not here to calm the sea. I am the part of the ocean that does not move. And so she called it cruelty, because women are taught that silence is aggression unless it is theirs, that when a man goes quiet, he must be hiding something, punishing someone, or playing games. But you were not playing, you were listening. Not to her words they were smoke, but to the deeper thing behind the noise, the ritual of collapse. The emotional warfare meant to provoke your confession, the hysterical performance built on the expectation that you would eventually break and plead. You didn't, and that made you dangerous, because now you were not part of the story. You had stepped outside the script. You were not the villain. You were not the hero. You were not even the lover. You were the silence that makes the storm realize it is wind chasing itself. She wanted you to fight back. She needed it. The argument was a dance to pull you into the labyrinth, and if you had answered even once, you would have been trapped. But instead, you became the stillness that exposed her chaos, the pause that made her fury feel performative, the unmoving center around which all of her confusion spun and cracked. You didn't leave. That would have been easy. You stayed, but you said nothing, and in doing so, you committed the unforgivable crime. You refused to validate the illusion. You did not rush to repair what was breaking. You did not name her emotions for her. You did not absorb the blame she flung like ritual ash. You simply stayed calm, rooted, unafraid, and this turned the storm inward. Now she had to hear her own voice. Now she had to watch herself rage. Now she had to feel the emptiness that her noise could no longer fill. You became the eye of the storm, still untouched, a man who no longer danced for peace. And that is what makes the world call you heartless, not because you are, but because you refuse to participate in the shared hallucination that chaos must be met with panic, that every emotional explosion must be met with a sacrifice, that love means constantly proving your guilt just to hold a hand. You stopped playing martyr, you stopped auditioning, You stopped explaining your soul to those who would twist it into their mirror. And in your silence, there was not absence, but presence. The kind of presence that doesn't seek approval, that does not rise to bait, that knows what it is. A man who does not fear being misunderstood, a man who does not tremble when misnamed. That is why she kept pushing, because silence, real silence, reveals. It becomes the ink blot onto which the world projects its shadow. And when she screamed that you didn't care, what she really meant was, you didn't collapse in guilt to prove my pain was holy. And when she said you were cold, what she really meant was, you were not seduced by my chaos. And when she said you were cruel, what she meant was, you refused to make me the center of your morality, because your silence was not passive. It was the sword you refused to swing. It was the boundary that spoke without needing volume. It was the moment you stood still and let the house burn because you knew the house was made of lies. And here is the secret: women know the script is rotten. They know the ritual is fake. But they need you to keep dancing it. Because if you stop, everything unravels. And you did stop. You didn't withdraw. You didn't punish. You just didn't perform. And so now, in the absence of your guilt, in the space where your panic used to be, there is only a man who sees, a man who listens, a man who refuses to trade his clarity for connection. And that kind of man is feared, not because he harms, but because he does not beg to be harmless. They will say you lack empathy. They will say you don't feel deeply, but they're wrong. You feel so deeply that you no longer rush to interrupt the storm. You've seen enough hurricanes tear men apart who thought they could fix a woman by becoming her reflection, and so you chose a different path. You became the place where storms go to die, not by fighting them, by outlasting them, because eventually every rage burns out, every chaos loses its rhythm, every scream runs out of voice. And when that happens, all that's left is silence, the one you carried from the beginning. And in that moment, she sees it. She sees that you are not like the others, not because you're stronger, not because you're colder, but because you are whole. You are not a man broken into apologetic pieces, trying to be liked by someone who does not know herself. You are not a boy pretending to be wise. You are not a rescuer. You are not a prophet. You are not a knight in emotional armor. You are the thing beneath all that, the man before language, the stillness before sound, the silence that does not seek to be understood. And for a moment, just a moment, she quiets, not because you made her, not because you won, but because the storm finally saw its reflection in the man who never moved. She does not thank you, she does not understand, but she will never forget. Because in a world of noise, of boys performing love and guilt and performance itself, you became the thing that doesn't move. The unshakable, the I, and all her storms, all her noise, all her fury, could not pull you from it. There is a room in her memory she does not name. No mirrors, no music, just silence, thick as oil. And in its center, a man who does not speak, not out of cruelty, not out of fear, but because the storm was never his. She still visits that room sometimes, in dreams, in doubt, in moments when her new lovers cry too easily and explain too much. She remembers the one who didn't, the one who watched her unravel without reaching to save her. And somewhere, in that unfinished silence, she begins to understand that the man who needed no forgiveness was the one she could never command.